Hi, my name's Jeff Umbro. I'm the founder and CEO of the Podglomerate.
So
Yeah.
I always kick things off with your podcasting origin story. So how did you get started?
I got started in a weird way. I was a book publicist back in 2014-ish, and I was obsessed with podcasts. I'd been listening to shows like This American Life since I was in high school. And I actually started a show with a friend called Writers Who Don't Write, where we would interview authors about their lives, their careers, and the one story that they could never tell. So
Like
fast
what year is
forward,
this?
this is like I believe 2014 through 2016, give or take. I might be a little off.
Okay,
Um,
gotcha. Early, but still early podcasting.
yeah, it was around the time Serial came out. Like I remember I had read Hot Pod for the first time, like in doing the research to create the show.
Uh-huh.
And it's so funny. Like back in the day, it was a very different newsletter than it is now.
Yeah.
But but yeah, it was super fun. I loved it. I had an excuse to like meet a lot of my literary idols, and it was a good excuse to spend more time with the friend that I was recording it with, and
Mm-hmm.
just fun. And then I realized through the process of this that like there was a million ways that I could actually make money on it. Like meeting these authors and bringing them into the PR firm that I worked at,
Yeah.
or in some ways we were selling ads, even though it was a pretty small show at the time. And yeah, that was the first time that I really experimented with podcasting, and I fell in love with it, and that was all she wrote.
And then
Uh,
so in that process of trying to sell your own ads, you started what became Podglomerate, right?
yeah, in a roundabout way, yes. And
Explain,
but
give us the
yeah,
Cliff's Notes of how that went down.
basically, I couldn't get a job making podcasts for anyone else, and I determined that I was ready for a career change, and I wanted it to be podcasting. So I went and I did a couple job interviews, and everybody was basically, they saw me as a hobbyist, which I was, and I really did not have any like deep knowledge of the industry, although I had been annoying all of my friends by obsessing over the industry. So long story short, I couldn't get a job, so I just decided to start my own thing. I was really lucky. I had, in hindsight, a very tiny savings account that let me quit my job and spend like 6 months doing this. If I could go back in time, I don't think I would have trusted myself to do it, but I got lucky. I got a couple great clients early on, and my idea initially was, let's bundle a bunch of shows together that are all a little bit small, try and package them together to sell to advertisers. And it worked to an extent, but like I realized why places like AdvertiseCast are so technology heavy. Just makes things a little bit easier to actually manage. So we moved into the production side of things and then the audience growth side of things. And fast forward to today, and the company has 9 employees full time. We're working with some of the biggest podcasts on the planet. We love what we do. It's super fun, and it is a far cry from back in my Writers Who Don't Write days, but I still miss it. So
No, so many people started with their little indie show that led them into the industry. So today, how do you work? You work with clients in different ways. So explain some of those ways that you work with people.
sure. So the three major things that we do today are production, audience growth, and monetization. So on the production front, we are a work for hire production firm that works with folks like A&E, Lifetime, the History Channel. We also produce our own content. We just published our first owned and operated, like truly original narrative series back in August called Missing Pages. We also sell ads on behalf of third parties, including folks like PBS, the World Surf League, LitHub Radio, and a handful of our own shows. In that context, we represent about 70 different podcasts and direct sales, agency sales, programmatic sales. And then really like our meat and potatoes of the business is our audience growth initiatives. So we focus on publicity, marketing, cross promotion, pitching the podcasting apps, paid acquisition. So we do that on behalf of 20 or 30 different partners, some really small publishers, some really large ones. And our entire mandate is, how do we grow these audiences in like a really smart, efficient, and affordable manner?
So, like on the monetization side, for those, people are always wondering, how many downloads do I need to join a network or whatever?
Mhm.
What are your kind of minimums? I know you're looking at different things in terms of fit, but what can people kind of expect? Or what do you guys look for?
Sure. I'm the king of non-answers, so I'll just I'll
At
fill you
least
in
you're
on
upfront
that
about
first.
it.
But
Yeah.
uh, There are just so many variables that like really factor into everything. If I twist my arm and I'm forced to give an answer, 40,000 monthly total downloads is really where it becomes worth doing based
Hmm.
on like the revenue that we'll receive from it. But it really so much depends on like what genre are you publishing, how frequently are you publishing? Is it like a 3-minute daily show versus a 10-minute weekly show versus an hour-long interview show that publishes a couple days a week? Like, are you doing dynamically inserted ads versus baked in? What kind of CPM are you looking for? But really, where it makes sense is at the 40,000 download a month number.
Uh-huh.
And even that, like, there's a lot of factors that are involved there. So, like, we have our formula, and it's not a difficult one to come up with. Everybody has their own version, but on average, you're going to see like a $25 to $35 CPM for an ad spot based on, the genre or the advertiser that you're working with. You can just plug that in and say like, how many ads do I have? How many downloads a month do I have? What's the overall consumption rate of an episode? Because if you
Hmm.
have 50,000 downloads a month, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to serve 50,000 mid rolls a month.
Totally.
Um, so it's a pretty simple math problem, but yeah, 40,000 is the number if you're gonna twist my arm on it.
Yeah, that lines up with what a lot of people say about like 10,000 an episode as a minimum
Yeah.
or something like that. Okay, so Private Parts Unknown is part of the Pleasure Podcast Network, and we just had a little meetup, and I wanted to ask you about, we were chatting, is there some economic uncertainty that's having an effect on ad buys right now? And yeah, someone just threw out like $20 CPMs are the new $25 CPMs. And I was like, oh, what?
Short answer is yes. And I don't know when anyone is going to be listening to this versus when this is released. And we're recording at the end of April in 2023 right now. The ad market has been soft over the last few months. Basically, like towards the end of Q4, it started to
Mhm.
really become apparent. A lot of that has to do with some macroeconomic issues. The economy is, depending who you ask, doing great or not so great. But ultimately, the numbers are a little soft right now. And if you want to go for like a bigger buy, you're often going to have to lower your CPMs because you're competing with a lot of people who are also doing that. But the longer version of that answer, which I'll keep very short, is it really depends on what your show is, what your past relationship to advertisers consists of. Like, has your show historically been able to perform and convert to new buyers?
Mhm.
And agencies pay attention to that. They have their own math problems that they're working out on their end. So there are a lot of shows that are able to kind of keep their CPMs where they are. There are quite a few shows that are having to lower them, hopefully for a temporary basis. So
Mhm.
I don't know that I would say that it's the new like average CPM, but for some shows, it is the new average CPM for right now.
For right now, yes, let's
Yeah,
definitely add that caveat. I want to pitch this as I just want to get your thoughts. So
sure.
I think the perfect marriage between, advertisers love baked in ads, right? And it's better for shows usually to do dynamic insertion over the long term. So I think what would be the perfect marriage would be having a sponsored by shout out for, especially for chat style shows at the beginning and end of the show. And you buy that along with a dynamically inserted mid roll. But the mid roll expires, like that is going away after 90 days or whatever your contract says. But the shout out lives forever, but you pay like a much higher premium for that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a wrong way to do this. I think there's a lot of people who have done cool experiments on this over the years. There's a show called The Adventure Zone, which is from the McElroy brothers and the Maximum Fun Network. And I'll be honest, I haven't listened to The Adventure Zone in a few years, but historically they did this thing. I think they called it the Jumbotron, and it was a big like fan show with a cult following. So they would have, I would call in and email them or pay $100 or whatever, and they would do a shout out on the Jumbotron for my brother's birthday or whatever it was. And that's like a baked in ad that was super relevant to the audience of that show. I'm sure you could do something very similar with like a more formal or traditional advertiser. And they would keep that in there forever. It was all baked into the episode. I think that there is a world where you can do any number of things here. You can, reserve the post roll or the pre roll for a baked in spot. You can use one or more of the mid rolls for dynamic. I personally don't do that for our shows only because it becomes like an administrative nightmare if
Yeah.
you're doing different styles for each of the shows. But then to your point, there's also the idea of a faked in ad where you basically run a dynamically inserted ad, but rather than looking at like an impression threshold, you timestamp that. So it'll expire after 90 days or whatever you want to do, could be a year. And then eventually it opens up the back catalog for more dynamic insertion. So
Right.
that's another way that you can kind of like split
do
the
both,
baby.
sorta. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I think especially for smaller shows, those kind of like offering a baked in and whatever, because you're doing more bespoke things with your advertising anyway. So let's talk about your 5 tiers of audience development. You want to break those down for the besties?
Sure. Love the name, by the way. But so I come from book publicity, and it always struck me as kind of funny that the publicity team at that publishing, firm that I worked at sat apart from the marketing team because so many of the things that they were doing overlapped and were
Mhm.
so complementary to one another. And I get it, like it's just the way it developed over the years, and it makes a lot of sense to kind of silo off those teams. But what happened as a result, and I haven't worked in publishing for a decade, so I don't know if this is still the case, but in my experience, like there was a little bit of a separation of doing one of these initiatives, which would, in theory, help to improve another, but the different folks at the company weren't really talking to each other.
Mm.
So there's a lot of gaps in that. So one of the things that I came to podcasting trying to do was to figure out a way to bridge that gap for the people that we work with. So we developed what is called the 5 tiers of audience development. It's not unique. I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with this, but it is publicity, marketing, cross promotion, pitching the podcasting apps, and paid acquisition. To break each of those down for just a second, publicity is the idea of trying to place reviews, interviews, features, a list of shows surrounding a certain topic in a different media property, whether that's a website, a newspaper, a magazine, a TV show, a blog, whatever. And we do that by drafting a bunch of press materials and coming up with a targeted list of who we're trying to reach. We call it a media pipeline. Everybody is a little different there. The marketing initiatives, as we see them, involve like how do we command your owned and operated properties, and how do we track the attribution on these things? So website, newsletter, social media, if you have an app or a live event or something like that. And you can even extend this to like a Reddit AMA or a Quora session or guesting on someone's newsletter or something. Like, how do you take these things that you're already engaging a piece of your audience and convert those to listeners of your podcast? And then how do you track if this is effective, and how can you continue to like iterate on that to make it more effective or stop doing the things that aren't working? So we have a bunch of strategies that we've developed over the years to help with each of these things. And most of the attribution is done with things like Chartable or pod sites, smart links, smart promos, etc. But we also have a little bit of knowledge when it comes to like Google Analytics and that kind of thing. The third tier is what we call cross promotion. Most of your listeners are probably very familiar with this because of some of your past episodes. But there is the idea of interviews on other shows that are similar in nature, feed drops, so publishing an episode of your show on another show, and audio cross promos. So I will read an ad for your show, you read an ad for my show. We'll figure out what kind of swap makes sense. The fourth tier, app pitching or retailer merchandising. It's the same idea as like you walk into a bookstore and you see a table in the front of the room with a bunch of books on it. That's actually oftentimes paid in a bookstore. Most of the time, yeah, it's called a co-op. And the publishers are spending like 100 grand or whatever to put Stephen King's book as like one of the displays on the airport bookshelves. So that's not always the case. Like there's plenty of these things that are curated by like real people, but oftentimes it's paid. So when it comes to like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, a lot of that occasionally is paid, but most of it, not on Apple or Spotify or anything, but for the most part, that stuff is curated by real people, and you can build up relationships and pitch them to try and get your show featured. New and noteworthy carousel, collection of certain topics. And there's also the idea of like the algorithmic selections. So in Apple, if I go on, Podcast Bestie, it might show me James Cridland's podcast. Or if I'd start typing in podcast on Spotify, you may be one of the first results. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can kind of, I don't want to say this in a nefarious way, but like manipulate those algorithms in different ways that you can pitch your show to be featured in like really smart ways. Like if you have a show on climate change or the outdoors, you can pitch it for like an Earth Day feature or something. And then the fifth tier would be paid acquisition.
Hang on 1 second. Give us one example of a way you could manipulate the algorithm for the good.
Yeah. Oh, I'm happy to. So as I understand it, one of the ways in which Spotify shows the results of a search function is they're actually going to prioritize the shows that are being searched the most frequently on their app. If they see that like 10,000 people have typed in Conan O'Brien, then they're going to like prioritize that when people are searching like the letter C or CO or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get smart about that. This doesn't so much work anymore, but historically,
Besties, you better type Podcast Bestie into Spotify right now. Okay, go on.
Yeah, no, it's a great thing to do. Honestly, like start your next newsletter with that. But I think that this one doesn't work so much anymore. But like years ago, we had a show it was a technology show, and they did an episode about Elon Musk, and they named it "Fly Me to the Moon." So yeah, we got tons of Spotify downloads for people that were mistaking it for the Frank Sinatra song. So I haven't really seen that recently, but I guess the idea is basically like you can SEO or optimize your show for these kinds of searches. And then the fifth bucket would be paid acquisition, which I know your listeners and followers are very familiar with, but we break that down into 5 buckets as well. There's the idea of in-app purchases, which you're doing already with Castro and Overcast and some others. There's the idea of audio promos. So you're basically buying like advertising on existing podcasts to feature your show. There is social media
directly
advertising,
or through Buzzsprout or something like that for those audio ads.
For the audio ads, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. There's like marketplaces that you can go to, such as Gumball or AdvertiseCast or something, where you can actually curate and select the shows that you want to purchase an ad on. There's also like programmatic marketplaces where you can do demographic targeting. Candidly, I don't love doing that because I find that it's not as efficient or effective, though I have seen it work well. And then you can also go directly to the publishers and purchase the spots through insertion orders and that kind of thing. And we do quite a bit of that. And then there's also social media advertising, which like has its uses, but like I generally don't think it's very valuable for promoting a podcast. There is the idea of buying spots in email newsletters, which is really valuable. And then there's a bucket that we call miscellaneous, which I would put something like Mopod in because it's kind of merging a few different like techniques there. And Podroll or SwapStack, which are, some newer platforms that are popping up, and like a Google display ad, I would probably put in that bucket. So those are the 5 buckets of audience growth or distribution that the Podglomerate uses. And we incorporate some version of all of those into each of our campaigns.
So yeah, you mentioned Missing Pages, which was an original show for you guys. And it sounds like you got to experiment with a lot of stuff and stuff you wouldn't normally do, with your clients if you didn't know how it worked. So can you give us a couple examples from that of things that you tried that you didn't know if they were going to work and they wound up working?
Sure. So Missing Pages is a show about a literary underworld, if you want to put it that way, but it's basically a true crime show for the publishing community. We take all of these things that have happened historically in the industry and kind of revisit them through the lens of what we look at today, as opposed to, some of these stories are 10, 20, 30, 40 years old. So it's not, I always hesitate to call it a true crime because it's an easy way to explain it, but it's not totally accurate. But our community of listeners that we wanted to reach were like readers, people in the publishing industry, people super into like audio docs and narrative style shows and that kind of thing. So we definitely targeted a lot of the shows that we found overlap in. Some of the things that we did that I thought were a little bit unique that we don't always get to do with some of our client shows would include, we did a partnership with Libro FM, which is an audiobook distributor. We had our host Beth Ann Patrick recommend a bunch of audiobooks, and Libro FM published a blog about that, and then they sent that out to this like big massive email list that they had of librarians, of some of their customers, of people who work in the publishing industry. We bought a bunch of ads from TikTokers who are big on like book talk.
Oh,
Um,
really? That's smart.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was super fun and interesting, but the one quirk of like the influencer marketing campaigns are that it's super time consuming for all of the reasons that you might expect. There are agencies that will do it for you, but the cost is usually pretty prohibitive.
Uh-huh.
Um, so we don't usually spend tons of time there. But in this instance, like the host of the show and many of the subjects of the show had such large social media followings that we really wanted to hammer in on that and make sure we took advantage. And it worked really well. Like we got a lot of engagement and traction, and with the right kinds of people. I think that we got a bunch of like influential listeners because of stuff like that, because we did a
Ooh.
really good job of targeting who we were reaching out to.
And then
And
they do the
then
marketing for you, right?
that's the dream.
Yeah.
And then one other thing that we did many things. We're actually working on a case study that we'll publish at some point, and we'll send it your way. But one of the other things that we did was that we partnered with Apple Books. So we actually had Beth Ann, who in her own right is a super well-known and renowned book reviewer for folks like the LA Times, Washington Post, and NPR. She curated a list of her book recommendations that were associated with each episode of the show. So we went to Apple and said, hey, do you guys want to do a list of this in your storefront? And you can promote like the audiobook versions of each of these books or something. So there was actually like a big carousel in the Apple Books, banner space that was promoting Beth Ann's book choices. And that was driving a lot of traffic back to the podcast. So
Oh, I bet they loved that. So I just talked to Lauren Passell about co-marketing and how to approach that with these apps. So that's a really smart way because you're helping them. And so that was, I'm sure, part of the strategy with it, right? You're helping drive
it,
traffic to them too.
yeah, that was the goal. Lauren's amazing, by the way. Everybody should subscribe to her newsletter and follow her on social and whatever. But I think that it really depends on like what your goals are and who you're talking to and what you're trying to do. Like somebody like Apple Books, like they're doing 1,000 things at once, and anything that we're gonna do to help them out is not really going to move the needle. Don't get me wrong, like we still did a lot. Like we had a dedicated episode in the feed. We
Uh-huh.
did some social media driving traffic back to Apple Books. We had big email newsletter blast. We did a PR push. But ultimately, like this was part of a bigger collaboration where Apple, I think, was interested in like building a bigger ecosystem between all of their different properties. So this one was pretty unique. When it comes to like how you can offer value back to these different platforms, I think that oftentimes the way you should be thinking about it is like, what are the listeners going to be interested in? And how can you make the curators at these different platforms' jobs easier by like kind of forecasting that idea and sending it their way? So if you have a basketball podcast, like the NBA playoffs are happening right now. So you can pitch a collection on like sports podcasts or basketball podcasts to tune in, or Apple Podcasts or whatever. And you can start to see trends in this too. Like every Monday, religiously, I'll open every different podcasting app and I'll just see what they're like promoting. And you'll notice all the time that, or at least over time, you'll notice that there's a lot of collections that they recycle year over year and just update with new shows. So then you can start
Oh,
to have like a calendar in your own head as to like, okay, next year they're going to do something for like, AAPI month,
yeah.
or they're going to do something for World Book Day. And you can start to anticipate that and shoot them a note early and often and that kind of thing.
That is
So
definitely a bucket I need to improve on. I just like never want to submit. I submit every so often and I feel so defeated about it that I just don't want to resubmit. So that's like
well,
definitely an area for improvement.
Well, the one thing I'll say there is that, depending on which numbers you're looking at, there's anywhere from like 280,000 to 5 million podcasts out there. Many of them are also submitting, and
Mhm.
Apple's like storefront, if I'm being optimistic, they're going to feature like 3,000 shows the entire year. So they're only ever going to feature like 1% of the shows that are being pitched. So it's tough. And I say that basically just to say, like, if
Don't
anyone,
feel bad.
for you and your listeners, it's like not everyone's going to be able to get that. And it's not going to be because of the quality of the show. It might just be because of 1,000 other variables that you have no idea like are happening behind the scenes.
Totally. But I think you can have some strategies to like make sure you're
Yes.
new and noteworthy and like
Mhm.
optimizing for the places that you can get featured.
And that
Um,
is correct. Yes.
so let's talk about paid a little bit. I've done some experiments with Mopod and Castro and Overcast, and I'm doing more are in progress now. So give us the lay of the land as far as options that you like.
Sure. Some of the platforms that we've seen a lot of success with would be like Podcast Addict or Podcast Republic. Honestly, the interesting thing with a lot of these different promotions are some of these apps are really small. And that's reflected in the cost of like what these promotions are. But it's kind of funny to look at because you might spend $100 on Podcast Republic or $500 on Podcast Addict or whatever. They all have a range of pricing and genres that you can target and different like promotions that they'll do and styles of promotion. And that's a good thing because it allows for people to be flexible and use like a sliding scale of cost and budget. But I think that one of the things that a lot of people do or should do is pay attention to like the overall genetic makeup of these apps. And what I mean by that is Overcast is traditionally an app that like a lot of like techies are using.
Mm.
And that has to do with like who founded the company and a lot of their policies on like privacy
Uh-huh.
and like how long it's existed and that kind of thing. And like, in
Just the way that he
everyday,
serves the ads.
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, an everyday hobbyist podcaster might not know that. So a lot of that comes with trial and error. But I find historically that like some of the like tech or business oriented podcasts will perform better over there.
Oh, that makes
Whereas
sense.
yeah, and Podcast Addict is an interesting one because, and I might be wrong here, so forgive me if I am, but like that's not an app that exists on iOS. So it's only Android users that are using that app.
Mm.
So like I'm sure that there's something that you can do or figure out based on your show that will help you like curate what that promotion will be. Something also that I saw that I was like fascinated by with Overcast is what I'll call contextual advertising. And it's the idea of like when you drive down the road and you see a billboard that's advertising McDonald's, it's not going to just say like, "Hey, McDonald's is a mile away." It might say like, "Are you hungry yet?" So I've seen people on Overcast will be promoting like some serialized fiction show or something. And the ad itself isn't talking about the show at all. It's saying like, "Are you bored on your road trip? Give us a try," or something. And that's a silly example.
Oh.
That's not what it said exactly, but you get the idea.
It's
And,
not just like, this is a relationships podcast. Tune in on Tuesdays or whatever.
yeah, instead it might say like Valentine's Day is coming up. Find out how to make your, spouse happy. Um,
Yes.
there's a lot of interesting ways that people are running these kinds of promotions that I think are like pushing the threshold a little bit, and it's been fascinating to watch. But I think to your initial question as to like what platforms should people be paying attention to, and I don't know if you're already running these tests. Forgive me if you are, but
No,
Podcast
please.
Addict is a good one. Pocket Cast is great, and there's a new one that we're experimenting with now that I think is kind of great. I don't have any data to report on it because we're still in the middle of our testing, but it's called SwapStack,
Oh, yeah, you mentioned. I
swapstack.co.
don't know it.
It's basically a marketplace for newsletter advertising. Uh,
Ooh, I should be in there.
yeah, you should absolutely be in there. And it's not just podcast like newsletters, it's all kinds of newsletters. So if you have a show about venture capital or skateboarding or something, then you can go to SwapStack and you can find a bunch of shows that have like correlating like editorial principles to whatever you're trying to promote. And you can actually choose to do cost per impression or cost per click model. So you can say, I'll pay $1 per click, and it'll allow you to cap it out. So you can say something like, I only have $100 to spend. I'll pay $1 a click. But like if a newsletter gets me more than 100 clicks, I'm not going to pay anything. And it's an auction system. So you propose that, and then the newsletter gets to say yes or no.
Ooh.
So yeah, it's super fun. And like what we're seeing so far has been, it's performing well. I can't speak like in specifics just because I don't have that info yet, but
Also, with a
it's
market like that where it's an auction, it's kind of hard to nail down.
exactly. But it's very promising, and I'm excited to play with it.
Ooh, I love that. That sounds like a really good potential experiment. I keep hearing Castbox, which it's just a little bit of an investment. So I'm like, "Ah,"
Yeah.
but everybody says it works. What's your thoughts?
Castbox is excellent. So taking one quick step back, one of the things that I always look at is just like the quality and retention of the listeners that you're going to get
Hmm.
from these different campaigns. They're all a little bit different. And what I'll say is like you might get an Overcast ad might be a little more expensive. And we have, over the years, we've bought a lot of different ads. I think at last count, we spent a little over $2 million in the last like 4 years on advertising. And we have all of the data from every campaign that we've ever run. So
Amazing.
yeah, it's great. We have like a literal spreadsheet with a bunch of filters in it. So I can actually say like, and these are not real numbers, but like pretending like Overcast has for a tech show has like an average of a $7 cost per subscriber, whereas Podcast Addict has a $4 cost per subscriber or something. And there's a million variables like the art, the copy, the timing, the cadence, all of
Uh-huh.
those things really do matter here. So you have to look at everything with a big grain of salt. So what I'll say about Castbox is that it is consistently the best performing platform to drive total traffic to a podcast by a long shot.
Do they stick
Uh,
around?
Most of them don't, but a lot of them do. So like even despite that, you might get 10 to 30% of your audience that actually is retentive like 3 months later.
Uh-huh.
But despite that, like they're driving so much traffic to you that you are oftentimes still doing really well there and better than some other platforms. So yes, it's expensive. Like these campaigns typically start around $3,000
Uh-huh.
and they can go up to 3 or 4 times that in cost. But I think it's really valuable both for driving total traffic and also for allowing you to do other things. Let's pretend that your show is getting, I don't know, 10,000 downloads a month. It's a weekly show. You run a Castbox campaign, that number goes up to 15,000 downloads a month or $20,000 a month. All fake numbers, just like for the point of the example. Then all of a sudden you have an extra 50% or 100% of inventory that you can use on cross promotions and that kind of
Yes.
thing. So then you're also using that inventory that you just got from the paid campaign to help grow the show with organic traffic. So there's a lot of different ways that you can like unspool this and think about it. And they're all really cool and exciting. But like at the end of the day, with everything that you do, you just have to like really take a step back at regular intervals and just say, like, what am I trying to do here? How am I doing it? Is it working? Should I reassess?
This show's geared towards indie podcasters. And if an indie podcaster just had like $500 to spend on their first ad buy, how would you tell them to spend that money?
Sure. There's a few directions that you can go there. I actually would say try SwapStack because at the very least, you're going to get a great experience and understand like more demographic info about your show and how you're positioning it and how it's going to perform. If you want something that's a little bit more certain about getting you some traffic, then I would suggest either like an Overcast or a Podcast Addict, both of which have targeting for like a big broad swath of their listeners and targeting for a very particular category. So like you can choose like comedy or tech or education. So you can like really hammer in on that. So either overcast.fm/ads or podcastaddict.com/ads. And both of them are going to give you a forecast of like what you're going to get for your money. And
Mhm.
they're usually pretty accurate. So you can literally say like, if this is telling me that it's going to cost me $300 to get 50 subscribers, then that's a $6 cost per subscription. And then you can say like, is that worth it or is it not?
I do find that Overcast, I can't run sex ads on there anymore, but from my
Yeah,
previous experiments, they stick around.
they do. Yeah, we've seen a lot of that over the years. And Overcast is funny because I didn't know about the sex ads, but we've tried to buy ads
That's a
for a
new
couple
thing in the last couple of
Is it?
years. It's like yeah, I think crypto now,
Yep.
sex shows, there are a few different categories like cannabis that you just can't
Yeah.
advertise.
Weirdly, I've found that a couple platforms, to my knowledge, not Overcast, but historically, there are a few platforms that won't allow like religious podcasts to advertise, which makes sense given the
Yeah.
context, but like is kind of a funny like line to draw. So, but I think that there's a lot of different avenues to do this, and the listeners will stick around. You just have to ask yourself, like, is this $500 that I'm going to spend worth what I will get out of this? Or I don't know, could you spend that money on like a production consultation or a new microphone or new podcast art or something? Like there's a lot of different ways that you guys can look at trying to grow that audience.
As far as free tactics, collaboration and owned media, especially, what are, the best ways to spend your time, which is also a limited resource?
Sure. Joni Deutsch on my team, she's our VP of marketing and audience development. She's brilliant. Has this line that she published for I think it's the Neiman Lab, like future of journalism predictions. I'm probably butchering that, but uh, it was essentially that like all audience growth is relationship building. And I've been for a decade now, I have a rule where I will send a minimum of 3 emails a week where I'm just introducing myself to somebody.
Nice.
And yeah, and it's not always because I want something. Often it is, but it's usually just to be
I
blunt.
appreciate the honesty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even so, like so much of this business is just about building community and fostering relationships. And I might send an email to someone and just say, like, hey, the episode that you did last week was awesome, or congrats on that award, or I love the new art, or even just say, like, hey, how are you?
Uh-huh.
But I think the key here is that you should build these relationships because hopefully they're genuine and you actually like want to, and you want to learn more about these people that you're listening to or reading or whatever. And then when you do have like a big episode that you want to promote or a new show that you're going to launch, you can send it to these folks and it's not going to be so transactional.
Yeah.
You're going to be like really genuinely showing them like this new thing that you're working on that you're really proud of that you want to help bring to a bigger audience, and oftentimes people are going to really respond in a good way to that. So I guess one free tactic is just send your 3 emails, introduce yourself, get to know people, and build meaningful relationships, whether you're going to use that like in the future to pitch something or not. So
I love that. That's great. Okay, so I have a recurring question for season 1. I have been asking everyone to audit me. I have 3 podcasts right now. It's too many. Private Parts Unknown is about love and sexuality around the world. The Bleeders about book writing and publishing. And this is podcast Bestie. So let me know what you think.
yeah.
What should I be
uh,
doing?
And this is mostly a joke, but I'll say it anyway, is do one instead of 3, and then you can spend more time on the one. Again, mostly a joke.
Yeah,
But
I wish I was like
yeah.
that.
I mean, I'm in the same boat. I have 100 projects at any given moment. But well, first of all, for the bleeders, email me and we can figure out something to do with missing pages.
Oh, cool.
Um, yeah, I'm sure there's something fun we can figure out. But again, I don't know which of these platforms that you're already experimenting with, but I would test out SwapStack. I
Uh-huh.
think one of the things that, and you kind of touched on this in your last episode about cross platform promotions, and I'm totally blanking on her name. She was brilliant, so I'm sorry.
Anna Van
Um,
Valen. Yes, she talked about
yes,
cross media promotions.
yes. Sorry, Anna. I love the episode, but I think that we often will do a lot of like cross-platform promotions. So, like we mentioned before, we talked about like the Apple Books promotion and Libra FM and everything. But even simpler than that, like we'll often email somebody who has like a similar newsletter or podcast, and we'll offer them a like ad spot on the audio side on our end and ask on their end that they like plug us in their newsletter or something.
Ah.
Um, and if you have the right audience fit and like demographic targeting or whatever, it's often going to be really, really effective. We've done this a few times with Morning Brew, for example. And I mean, you get thousands of people who click through that newsletter and come back to whatever you're
Mhm.
promoting. So my recommendation for you is to start thinking about newsletters that overlap with yours. And I know that you've done a lot of this already. I've seen them, but like the Laurens, the Ariels, the Jameses of the world, I'm sure that there's something that you can do where you give them a shout out in your newsletter or your audio spot, and in exchange they'll do the same for you. Have you already done that?
A little
I
bit, but
think
I know you're totally right. I need to like leverage because I have, multiple email lists and I have these different podcasts. Like I have audiences to leverage for cross
yeah.
promotions, but I mean, that's why people hire you to do it, right? It's a lot of work.
It's exactly why. Yeah. Uh, it's so funny. We're actually working on like a platform right now that it's going to be like a hybrid podcast, newsletter, and website that's going to basically like share a lot of these learnings that we've had over the years. And I say we're working on because I've become a perfectionist with this and like don't want to release it until it's ready. And now I'm just, you know, convincing
It's like,
myself it's never going to be ready.
yeah,
But
that Beach Boys album, they were like, we can't do
yeah.
it.
I mean, I wish it would be as good as that, but that's going to be a way that we basically, we're going to try and synthesize a lot of the things that we do and boil it down to something that anybody can do at home. And the
Mhm.
ultimate goal is basically to like bridge the gap between like the guy in his parents' basement recording his first podcast at 16 years old and like the CMO of a Fortune 500 company.
Mhm.
Who knows if we can do it, but that's the goal.
Nice. Cool. Anything else in the audit space? More
Um,
collaborations?
More collaborations. I would try out SwapStack and Podcast Addict and Pocket Cast and Castbox if you haven't. I think with your show, I listened to a couple episodes and I really enjoyed it. I think this is something I'm actually struggling with myself because we're developing a podcast about the podcast space for this platform, but I think it's really tough to figure out how to speak to your peers in this industry because so many people have their own ideas and agendas about like what they want to know and what they want to share and that kind of thing. And I actually commend you because I think you're doing a really great job of it. But I think the key that you have to solve and that I have to solve and that everybody in this space has to solve is like, how can you make this show applicable to a bigger audience? Because there are only so many people like that are podcast nerds like us that want to listen to this stuff.
Oh, beyond podcasters, podcast
Yeah.
bestie. I
Yeah.
am finding though there are a lot of people that want to start a podcast. Like, that's why we have millions of podcasts. There is actually a large audience of these
Oh, I
aspiring
and they're
podcasters.
and they're all amazing people and it's a great audience and especially because like you know how to do this so well, like everything you're offering is so valuable and thus the platform becomes a lot more valuable. I don't know, I just think that like at a certain point, like and again I'm having the same problem here, so I'm just thinking this one through myself, but
Do you think it's
uh
offering higher level information or low? Like, what are you?
I don't know, I haven't solved this one yet. Like half of me is like, I want to throw the podcast idea out the window and make it like a media show, but I think that's just a different show.
You
So
probably could do that though. Yeah.
one day. So, but yeah, I think you should really like lean into the idea of like SEOing your show
Mm.
and think through like the idea of like how people are searching for these topics and like what questions they're asking, both Google and Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And there's all kinds of fun quirks. James Cridland of Pod News wrote up an article about a year ago that was pretty fascinating. Basically, mapped out what each of the different podcasting apps showed in their search results. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, so the only thing that appears in the vast majority of search results for every podcast player is going to be the show title, the episode
Uh-huh.
title, and the author tag. So, like the show description stuff, still incredibly important, especially depending on which platform you're looking at and like your website and everything. But really, all of this is going to come down to the title, like how you're framing that. And like, do you put your guest name in the title? Do you pull like a quote or something for what they talked about that's trying to answer a question that somebody might be searching for? Like, what do? Who knows? And that's your answer to figure out.
Yeah,
So
I've tried to get a lot savvier and longer really with my episode titles because you got to keyword stuff a little bit.
yeah, I'm
Okay.
learning the same thing. So
My last question for you is a selfish question, another two selfish questions. So I'm about to try to sell a book and trying to
congratulations.
leverage. Thank you. Well, I mean, there's nothing. I got an agent, very good agent who is well versed in six-figure deals, which was my dream. But what's your advice? Any advice from your book publishing days? I'm
Yes,
trying to
but
leverage my podcast audience. I have two proposals. I'm trying to leverage my podcast audience for both because they're both semi-sex related, but one of them is like directly inspired by that podcast.
I think the publishing world that I was a part of is different than like selling the book. And I honestly like I
Oh, because
have
you
a
were in the
bird.
promotion side.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do have a bird's eye view into that. I was friends with a lot of agents, but the key there is being able to sell yourself. So like the topic of the book matters just as much as like the promotional platform that you've built for yourself. And I think for something that is like so specific on topic there, like you have a perfect audience for it. So that's a good thing. So I would grow that audience as much as you can. And so much of like what the promotional vehicle is about like how do you frame it. So for example, like if you got a Webby award, your show is all of a sudden like an award-winning podcast. If Lauren
Yes.
Passell says that podcast Bestie or the sex show is great and like puts it in her life hacker article, then all of a sudden you're critically acclaimed.
Uh-huh.
So there's like a funny way of going about it, and it's all fugazi for the most part, but it works and people pay attention to it. And from what I can gather, you're already very savvy with all of that stuff. So I'm sure you're doing the right things.
Perfect. Okay, let's manifest it.
Yeah.
Any final words you'd like to leave the besties with?
Keep doing the stuff that you all love. I think so many people get into podcasting because they think they're going to get rich and famous. And and that's great
It's
if
a
you
very long
can.
game if you ever get there.
Yeah. I mean, hey, if you can do it, that's awesome. It's a lot of fun. But I think that the key is really to like take a step back and look at why you're doing it, and like, is this helping you to figure something out or to meet people or to make a small amount of money or
Mhm.
increase business endeavors elsewhere, or because you just enjoy doing it. Like, know the answer to that question before you make a show is really like the advice that I would give.
Perfect. Thank you so much.